Lewis Nixon once said that war revealed who men truly were, but for Denver Bull Randleman, the truth of his character seemed obvious to everyone who served beside him. Even Richard Winters, a man not given to exaggeration, described him simply as the best soldier in the company. It wasn't said for effect. It was said because, in the chaos of combat, Randleman had proven it again and again. Years later, when Michael Cudlitz stepped into his boots to portray him in Band of Brothers, he quickly realized that understanding Bull wouldn't come easily. When they first met, Randleman kept his distance. He wasn't interested in reliving the past, nor in helping someone recreate it. It was only through his wife, through her stories, her quiet observations, that Cudlitz began to piece together the man behind the reputation, steady, grounded, and far more complex than the myth. Much of what audiences saw on screen was shaped by interpretation, rather than first-hand testimony. Bull never wrote a memoir, never sat down to document his experiences for historians like Stephen Ambrose. Instead, his story lived in fragments, conversations, recollections, and the memories of those who had stood beside him. One of those moments, shared later with Winters, spoke of how he was among the first in easy company to engage the enemy, stepping into the unknown with the kind of quiet resolve that defined him. Through the war he endured what many could not. In Holland, near Nuenen, a burst of machine gun fire tore into him as his company faced a formation of German tanks. Wounded and cut off, he found himself alone in a village held by the enemy. Night fell around him, thick with danger, every sound a reminder of how close death lingered. And yet, by morning he was still alive. Members of the 3rd Battalion eventually brought him back, but it was his own resilience that carried him through that night. He survived the war, though survival never meant untouched. Like many who came home, he carried it with him in ways that couldn't be easily seen. Still, he built a life, working in the earth-moving business, raising a family, growing older in a world far removed from the one he had once fought in. Even in his 80s, there was a sense that the past had not let go of him, nor he of it. At 82, he traveled across the world, attending reunions and premieres, reconnecting with the men and memories of World War II. He had endured the bitter cold of the Battle of the Bulge, where frostbite had permanently scarred his legs. When asked about the pain years later, he brushed it aside. What stayed with him wasn't the cold, it was the men who didn't make it out. Not long after those journeys, his life took a quieter, more fragile turn. A routine surgery meant to prepare him for dialysis led him to a nursing home in Texarkana, a temporary stop it was supposed to be, just enough time to recover. His wife, elderly herself, could not care for him during that period, and so he placed his trust in the system meant to look after him. At first, everything appeared normal. Records showed his wound healing as expected. Day after day marked as stable, uneventful. On paper, there was no cause for concern, but reality told a different story. By mid-June, when he arrived at a scheduled checkup, something was clearly wrong. He was pale, disoriented, struggling to breathe. The wound that had been described as healing had turned red, swollen, and dangerously infected. What should have been caught early, what should have been routine, had been missed entirely. The infection had advanced, forming an abscess. The surgical shunt became visible through the damaged tissue, a stark and disturbing sign of how far things had deteriorated. What began as a manageable complication had escalated into sepsis, the infection spreading through his bloodstream. The warning signs had been there, unmistakable and treatable, but they had gone unnoticed. Staff shortages, lack of oversight, those explanations would come later. None of them changed what had already happened. It's hard to reconcile that end with the life he had lived. This was a man who had survived gunfire, isolation behind enemy lines, and the freezing forests of Belgium. A man awarded the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star Medal for his service. A man who had outlasted war itself. And yet, in the end, he was undone not by combat, but by neglect. He died less than a year after entering that facility. The institution responsible was fined, a figure in the hundreds of thousands. But for a corporation operating at scale, it was little more than a financial inconvenience. For his family it was something else entirely. Cudlitz would later reflect that a life like Randleman's couldn't be measured in numbers. It wasn't something that could be balanced against fines or settlements. It was built from moments, acts of courage, loyalty, endurance, and from the quiet strength that carried him through both war and peace. His story doesn't end cleanly, and it doesn't offer easy closure, but it does leave something behind, a reminder perhaps that the way a society treats its people at their most vulnerable says as much about it as any victory ever could. And somewhere in that memory, Bull Randleman still stands, not as a character, not as a story shaped for television, but as a man who endured, who returned, and who deserved better than the way his final chapter was written.